Hello everyone! Today, we will be making Mediterranean quesadillas. Here are the supplies that you will need. A cutting knife, a cutting board, a 1 cup measurement, a pair of scissors, a box grater, a large plate, a large mixing spoon, a large mixing bowl, a spatula, I'm using a rubber one, and a pan, mine is cast iron. Here are the ingredients that you will need for this recipe. 1 medium red onion, 3 Roma tomatoes, 2 cups of spinach, 8 ounces of feta cheese, I'm using a block, but the crumbled kind is also fine, 8 ounces of low moisture mozzarella cheese, and 10 quesadilla wraps. Any type is fine. Now let's get cooking. Start by taking your onions and removing the outer part. Cut off both the ends of your onion. Next, cut it in half and remove the outermost layer. This part is typically thin and doesn't taste very good, so we don't use it. You can now begin to make vertical cuts on your onion like so, and try to keep the lines nice and thin. If you are not a huge fan of onions, feel free to use only half of the whole thing, or you can omit it completely. After you finish up those vertical cuts, start to make horizontal ones. The onion's layers should start to come apart, and once they do, you can go in and chop them like so. If cutting onions makes your eyes tear up, an alternative is using a mandolin chopper. The chopper can also be used for other steps in this recipe. Meanwhile, as you finish chopping your onion to around this size, you can go ahead and add it to your bowl. Next, measure out 2 cups of your spinach. Please note that you may end up needing more than what you have already measured out because of shrinkage after chopping. The best way to chop up your spinach is to bunch it up into one hand on the board and use the other hand to cut it up into strips using the knife. It's also best to start with smaller bunches of leaves, especially if you're a beginner. Once you finish the initial cuts, begin to chop up the spinach with the same technique used for the onion. When your spinach looks something like this, be sure to measure it out again in the same cup measurement you used earlier. If the same amount of spinach is not enough, you will have to chop more using the same technique if this is the case. When the chopped spinach measures to 2 cups, you can add it to your bowl. Next, take your tomato and cut the top part off that contains the stem. Cut it in half and then split it into vertical chunks as shown here. Because tomatoes are full of juice on the inside, it is important to extract as much moisture as we can from it to avoid soggy quesadillas. To do this, use the tip of your cutting knife and remove the parts of the chunks with the seeds like so. To make the most of the tomatoes you're using, I would recommend making this recipe with stiffer tomatoes because they typically have less seeds that you will end up having to remove. Once all of the seeds have been extracted, you can discard them and start to dice the tomatoes with the same technique used for both the onions and the spinach. When the diced tomatoes reach this size, measure them out and make sure you have a cup. You may need to cut more than 1 tomato to achieve this. Next, you can either add the tomatoes to your bowl or do this optional step to remove even more moisture. Put all of your diced tomatoes into a medium-sized strainer. With a small bowl underneath to catch the juice, use your fingers to squeeze even more liquid out as shown here. When you have extracted as much moisture as possible, measure the tomato and repeat this step if you don't have a full cup yet. Otherwise, add it to your bowl with the other vegetables. If you are not a huge fan of tomato, you can also feel free to use half or completely skip them in the mixture. However, if you do choose to use less tomato, please note that the amount of mixture you end up with will yield less quesadillas than the amount shown on the recipe page. Following the tomatoes, open up the low moisture mozzarella cheese and begin to grate it. If you are using a longer block like the one that I'm using, feel free to break it in half for easier control while you're grating. Be sure to use the large hole side of the grater. Only grate as far as you are comfortable with to avoid cutting yourself. When you are done, add the cheese to the bowl. Next, cut the plastic off of the feta cheese over a sink. Because there's a lot of liquid in the packaging of your feta block, it will need draining. Once the salt water is out, get the feta onto a plate and start to crumble it like so. Because feta is very brittle, it will break apart very easily in your hands. If you are not a huge fan of getting your hands dirty, feel free to grate the feta with the same side of the grater we used for the mozzarella cheese. Once the feta has reached this consistency, you can add it to the bowl. Now that we have all of our ingredients ready in the mixture, start to carefully mix it with your large spoon. Since your bowl may be very full, try to fold the mixture into the center to avoid overflow. You can also use 2 spoons for more control. If you added the ingredients in the same order of this video, then you will know the mixing is getting there when you start to see onions surfacing at the top. If your spinach is cut fine enough, you may even start to see it stain the cheese's green with its juice. Once you start to see even distribution of all of the ingredients towards the top, you will know you are done mixing. On your stove, add a small spiral of cooking oil to your pan and keep it on medium heat. It will take around 5 minutes for the pan to heat up. In the meantime, you can prepare your tortillas, wash a few dishes, or mentally prepare yourself to cook your quesadillas. Lay a tortilla flat on the pan and add 2 large spoonfuls of mixture on one side of it. Try to leave an inch of space between the filling and the tortilla's edge. Next, fold the empty half of the tortilla over the filling to create a half circle shape. I'm using my hands to do this, but if you are inexperienced, then I would highly recommend using your spatula for this step. Once folded over, press down on the quesadilla with your spatula. This will help seal it while the cheese melts. As the first side is cooking, occasionally check underneath it to see if the tortilla has been browned to your liking. When the first side is ready, it's time to flip it over. To do this, slide your spatula underneath the quesadilla and lift it up like so. Without hesitation, turn the spatula around and let the quesadilla land back onto the pan. It is best to do this with no hesitation. However, if you do end up spilling some filling, take a spoon and scrape it off of the pan so it doesn't burn. When the second side is brown to your liking, remove it onto a plate and use a pizza cutter to cut it. And that's it. Please note that you can make a bigger quesadilla with 2 tortillas. However, flipping it will be a bit more difficult. These tasty quesadillas make for a great family dinner. Hope you enjoy!